She grew up in Siberia in the 1970s, where being Jewish was encoded in your face and your passport, but couldn't openly be practiced. Welcome back to the TrailBLAZER Pod. I'm your host Faye, and each week I bring you stories of Jewish women paving bold paths. This week, scholar, author, and researcher Izabella Tabarovsky joins me to talk about Soviet Jewish identity, anti-Zionism on American campuses, and what the past is trying to tell us about the present. Let's dive in. Oh, and hit follow and subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming. Izabella, welcome to the TrailBLAZER Pod. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's so nice to meet you. I think this is a really interesting one for me because some of the guests I've had on, they talk about their history and like maybe their parents came from the Soviet Union, but I don't think I've ever had a guest on that actually went through that experience herself, especially, teenage years, which is like we really remember that. So I'm excited to really learn from you instead of just reading the books. It's a whole different experience. So let's start from there. Can you talk to me about what Izabella was like as a little girl, where you grew up, what life was like in those early years?
Well, wow, I don't even know where I start. I can start with actually announcing the date of my birth. I don't mind dating myself.
I
I was born in 1970, which I think probably for a lot of your audience will sound so ancient. But I always say it because I want people to understand, kind of to place me correctly, what era that is. For those who know, for those who understand, this is Brezhnev's USSR, which means that, Leonid Brezhnev was the head. And it's basically a stagnation. It's like nobody's really excited anymore about communist ideology, but everybody keeps going through the motions. So there is this kind of, on the one hand, this authoritarian feel, and everybody has to say the same thing. You can't really, dissidents are punished, including Jewish dissidents very much are punished. But on the other hand, it's not Stalin's times, so it's not, you're probably not going to be dragged to the to prison, to the gulag, as it's known, the punishment system in the USSR, unless you do something really terrible, like be a dissident. So I grew up in a small town that was kind of a suburb of a bigger town called Novosibirsk. It's in Siberia. And the suburb was actually an academic center. So there was a university, there was research institutes. And, it was a quiet place. It was interesting that it was very Jewish, but very secular, because by then Jews had already been so assimilated through, it was essentially, there was a forced assimilation policy in the USSR. You couldn't really practice Judaism. You couldn't really you couldn't exercise anything related to your Jewishness, and you didn't really learn anything about your Jewish identity unless you were part of the dissident circles, which we were not. And so it was really strange. It's only in retrospect when I think about it, I think how strange it is that, we all knew that we were Jewish, but if you asked us what did it really mean, I don't think we would have been able to answer, except for, anti-Semitism. Like we knew that we are subject to anti-Semitism. But, there's this thing that I think about a lot that, when you were growing up in the USSR, they made a really big deal about the fact that it was a socialist country, friendship of the peoples, lots of nationalities or ethnic groups living under that roof. And they always said, well, we are, we love everybody. We don't discriminate against anybody. And so as a little girl in school, I had to learn, the dances of different groups, the songs of different groups. And I could tell you, this is what Georgians eat. This is what Uzbeks wear. This is what Ukrainians dance. But if you ask me, what do Jews eat? What do Jews wear? What is, what are Jewish songs? I wouldn't have been able to tell you. So it was a very peculiar thing.
So, when you were saying you understood that anti-Semitism was a thing, did you understand why, or was it more like a fact of life for you?
It's a really good question. I think it was really just a fact of life. I think Soviet Jews, we understood our Jewishness in a way that's almost, it's maybe close to kind of a racial identity, because how did they recognize us as Jews? We didn't have mezuzahs on our doorposts. Men didn't wear kippot. There was no way to know. There was no synagogue to go to. so how do people recognize us? They recognized us by our looks. And what were the looks? A lot of times Americans would ask me, what does it mean? What does a Jew look like? And I think in the context of the USSR, it's sort of, I call it like this Mediterranean look. It's in the context of the USSR, it was almost always really the only thing you could be, pretty much, would be Jewish, if you were in Russia especially, which is very Slavic. And then there were those who had Jewish names also stood out. And then, of course, all Jews also had their Jewishness written in the internal identification documents. Everybody was, it was called a nationality. So if your parents were Ukrainian, or one of your parents was Ukrainian, you could say I'm Ukrainian, right? It would be written in your internal passport. So for Jews, it was written that we were Jewish. But, so it was only for Jews that this was a ground for discrimination. Right. We knew that, if we came to apply, for example, to university, and we showed this internal document, they would know. If they didn't recognize us by our face or by our name, they would know it through our passport. Wow. And then that may open us to discrimination. And same with workplaces. If you wanted to apply for jobs, certain jobs were closed, certain professional paths were closed. And so this is how you just understood it, that you are just somehow different. You look different, but you never really knew what it meant.
Such an interesting balance over there of this is really a part of your life and you're just not sure what that means. Did you ever question, a girl walking through this type of world of why us? Or again, it was just an understood thing that this is just what happens to Jews?
I don't think I ever really asked this myself. I just took it for granted, but I know that there were, Soviet Jews who became dissidents, who became refuseniks, which is what my book is about. They did go through this process of really trying to explain to themselves, or even before they became dissidents, this is how it started for them. They would ask themselves, well, what does it mean? Why am I discriminated against? How am I different from everybody else? I know the same Russian literature, I speak the same Russian language, I love Russian music. It's like I'm completely Russian in every way. So why am I discriminated against? And so then when the Refuseniks started their movement, they spent a lot of time actually, thinking, writing about what does it really mean to be a Jew? It was a really difficult question, I think, for Soviet Jews, and it took a lot of exploration.
Yeah, and it's interesting how almost full circle now your work is really looking into that. And it's just interesting how as a girl, it's almost like this is just the fact, and then as an adult, you're looking at it from a different lens. It's very interesting.
It's a really good observation, because I think actually I would say that from the moment that we emigrated to the US, which was, for me, I was 20. I was 19 when we left, and by the time I arrived in America, I was 20. It took a few months. And ever since then, I think, from that moment on, I think I spent probably a couple of decades trying to define for myself, what does it really mean to be Jewish? Because, when I came to the US, I wanted to connect to American Jews, because I understood that we left because we were granted permission to have the special status in the U.S., that made us eligible for green card and then citizenship. I knew it was because we were Jewish and we had been discriminated against as Jews. And so I think that's when I started to ask myself the question, what does it really mean? And so when I started trying to connect to American Jews, it wasn't an easy process. It was difficult for many reasons. Mostly, I would say, because the American Jewish experience was so different from ours. There were so few things that connected us, so few points where it intersected. And it took me a very long time before I found myself comfortable in a synagogue, because again, no Hebrew at all, not even being able to read basic prayers. And I would say even more than that, the Soviet society was atheist. And so to go into a synagogue, it's not like we necessarily, it's more than atheists. They really ridiculed faith, and they really ridiculed religion and God. And so, for me to be in a synagogue just felt really strange. And like I was just in a strange place. And I think for a lot of ex-Soviet Jews, this was one of the hardest transitions, to transition to being part of a religious community. Wow. So yes, it took me a long time.
So interesting. It's also, you came here at a very pivotal point in a young woman's life. A lot of us go through these questions about ourselves at 1920, like any normal, young adult would, and you just happen to come here and have that massive change at that time. So it makes a lot of sense that that's when you started, having those questions about why us, what are we, what, all those big identity questions that we all go through. You did say that you came here in 1920 and you've talked about like this culture shock in the professional world. So I want to start by asking you, what is a 17, 18-year-old girl? I think you moved from Siberia to Moscow at that point. Like, what did you envision for your life, professionally wise or career wise? And how did that shift when you got here?
That is such another great question. So the last 2 years of my life in the USSR, I actually lived in Moscow. So I knew for sure that I wanted to live, Novosibirsk, I wanted to live in Moscow. I don't know why, I just really wanted to, big city. And also it's, it's perestroika. It was a big change, reform, really, really difficult time, but a lot of exciting change. And so I wanted to be there. But I never really knew what I wanted to be honest with you, who I wanted to be. And, I love it that in the US, young people go into college and they still have 4 years basically to decide, right? You don't have to declare your major. You can still go and investigate and explore. And in the USSR, you had to already decide by the time you applied to college who you're going to be, because there were these specialized institutes a lot of times. You had to choose your specialization then. And I didn't really know, but I knew that I wanted to be in Moscow. And I also knew that I liked languages. And so I had studied English and I thought, okay, well, I think I want to be somewhere where I can keep learning English. And the only place really where I could apply was a teacher's college. Now, I didn't want to be a teacher, but that was the only place, in part, by the way, because of anti-Semitism. Other schools that I wanted to apply to were closed to Jews because I think they opened the door to foreign kind of careers in foreign something, that would have put you in touch with foreigners. And as Jews were always under suspicion as, if call them Zionists. So, it's the time of this anti-Zionist campaign. So there's a lot of paranoia about Jews who might be Zionists and might, betray the country. And so I was just told outright, they were like, don't even bother. They won't accept you. They don't take Jews. And so I went to this teacher's college. It was still an adventure trying to get in, but we emigrated just in time because I studied there for 2 years and I knew that I didn't want to be a teacher. And I was like looking ahead with such kind of this sense of doom, like what am I going to do when I graduate? And especially there were these obligatory positions that you had to take right after college. Wow. So I thought they would just send me to some village, where nobody cares about English or anything like that. I never, I didn't want to live in a village. Yeah. But we emigrated 2 years, after 2 years. And that's when, the choice of a career, that was another question that really bedeviled me, because once I realized, this is obviously before the internet. So I think there were these big, thick books that published, I don't know, like what are different professions, and so I remember looking through some of them and I was like, my God, I've never even heard of such professions. Wow. The professional world is so much bigger. It's like, what do I want to be? I have no idea. And so for a long time, it was like this kind of trying to feel my way into what it is that I want to do and who I want to be, and again, it took me a long time. I mean, I think now I feel like I'm at the right place. I work on a topic that interests me, that I feel passionate about. I use my best skills, but it took a while to figure it out. And I do wonder sometimes, if I was born in the US and I had the same opportunities to explore things, I wonder if I would have arrived at it earlier. But I think coming at that junction, as you very perceptively said, the age of 1920, It's like, you're in a foreign world at an age where you're supposed to have already been able to make some choices, and yet you're completely new and you don't know what you're going to do with your life.
It's so interesting because, we have such shared human experiences no matter where we come from. Like, I observed being on this podcast or hosting this podcast, how so many of us think we know what we want to do at 18, 19, and then we end up completely pivoting our careers. And a lot of us don't even use our degree in a traditional way. And we have to figure it out later on too. It's just we
Yes.
think we know, then we realize we don't really know, and we come to the same place eventually. So
Yes.
I find that really fascinating. I'm also I studied sociology in college. I enjoyed seeing the patterns with like different, how culture and society affects us, and how we all at the end of the day have all these like really similar human experiences, you know?
Oh, I love that. No, I completely agree with you. I think that, the paths that we take are so, life just takes us where
Yeah,
it needs to take us.
exactly.
And I think that
Yes.
it's very few people, I think, who know early on what they want to be and they stay on that path.
Right, right. So, when you come here and you end up choosing a master's over a PhD, and, you've talked about that process a little bit, but a lot of your work ends up involving Russia in some way, right? And so I want to
Yeah.
understand, obviously we can talk about your work specifically, but did you as a young woman feel the pressure to like translate your experiences for an American audience? Like I feel like that's a lot of pressure for a young person. Like now you're almost like expected, like, oh, you're the one with this like Russian experience, like now bring it to us. I'm like, did you feel a little bit like boxed into that?
It's interesting. Not right away. I think in a
Mm-hmm.
way I actually went into the field, which is Russian studies, and I worked for consulting companies that have to do with Russia. I kind of did a variety of things. They all had to do with Russia. That was really because I couldn't come up with anything else,
Mm.
to be completely honest with you. I don't think I didn't feel pressure to explain my experience, not too much. And in many ways, I think from the beginning, I sort of set myself the goal of just becoming an American. I thought that I thought that the US was such an incredible country and system, and I just wanted to be part of it. I wanted to learn as much as I could about it. And ironically enough, I think it's not until a few years ago that I suddenly realized that my Russian past has some clues to the present, my own, and also in the way that I perceive the world, because I've been writing the thing that I've been focusing on the last almost a decade at this point, which is, the anti-Zionism, the
Yeah.
anti-Semitism that comes from the Soviet Union, and how ex-Soviet Jews perceive that. I realized that I needed to understand better my own experience as a Jew back there, and to try to explain it to Americans, but this is, I can't say that I was pushed into it. I just felt like I needed to do that.
Yeah.
And I think I resisted it for a while. I didn't want to, but then I ended up getting into it
Interesting.
anyway.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, because it's hard work to have to reflect all of that. I totally get it. So you mentioned this. You said in a interview, an article, one of those, I'm going to quote you, the way the Soviets talked about Zionism and Israel and the way American campuses were talking about Zionism and Israel were virtually the same, you said. What did you notice about it, and when did you notice this?
Yeah, so I think I first noticed it around 2017.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there's a very specific episode. I often talk about it in my talks and interviews, when I was watching TV and there was an item on the news that showed a protest at an American campus with students carrying these signs, Zionism is racism, etc. And I was so surprised. And at that point, I hadn't really thought about it too much, about my experience of anti-Semitism back in the USSR. I
Mm-hmm.
knew what I had experienced. I simply called it anti-Semitism. These were people who hated Jews. But then I saw that protest and I thought, wow, this looks familiar, and it looks weird, and it looks really anti-Jewish. Why am I seeing it on an American campus? I'd never seen it in America before. And I remember calling my dad and sharing it with him. And I said, they also say that they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just being anti-Zionist.
Right.
And my dad just laughed, and he was like, yeah, we've heard this before. And that's when I thought, wow, okay, we have heard this before. That's why I'm having this strange reaction, trying to decipher it. And that's what really started the whole thing.
Wow.
This question in my mind, it just wouldn't let me go. I was like, what is it that we really knew in the USSR? What did we see? What forms did this anti-Semitism took? And then once I understood the incredible similarity, then the question for me was, well, how did it come here?
Right.
How did it come to America? And why now? Because I hadn't seen it before. Why is it here now? So really for the next several years, I kind of, that was the question that drove me. And I spent a lot of time in libraries and research centers and, just trying to find answers to these questions. And I think I have, broadly speaking, I now understand what happened.
When you go through your work, you can see a lot of that involves this question and the answer to this question. Before we go to your book right now, I want to just ask you, we talked about how you didn't really have a sense of what being Jewish was in the USSR. You just knew I'm Jewish and you knew that anti-Semitism exists. When you came to the US, did you start having more of an understanding, I guess from an American perspective, of what Jewishness is?
Well, for sure. And yes, that also, it took some time, but then at the age of around 40, I think, I finally found a congregation where I felt comfortable, where I didn't feel embarrassed about the things I didn't know. They never asked me about anything. They just made me feel welcome, and they taught me everything. And just so you understand the extent of my ignorance, I didn't know what Kaddish is, I didn't know the Shema, very basic things. Or I would sit in the synagogue and I'd be completely lost, and somebody next to me would point to the line where we are in the Siddur. And I'm like, they have no idea. I can't even read the letters, So
It's like, thank you for your help.
right, exactly. So I learned so much, and I think that really helped me understand the meaning of what it means to be a Jew for me, what it means to be a Jew in America. I think the biggest revelation for me, or the biggest insight, was that being a Jew is a choice, and that we make that choice every day. Because I think in the Soviet kind of framework, you can't do anything about being Jewish because it's like it's encoded in your face, therefore you can't change it. It's like it's on the genetic level, you are Jewish. But in America, really, you begin to understand that you are Jewish because of what you do. Do you like it's because it's of what you do basically with your Jewishness. You can just disconnect with it completely, and you could still say, yes, I'm Jewish because my mother is Jewish. But again, Judaism is about actions, and who are you with? What do you do? So that was, I think, the biggest insight for me.
I've never heard anyone frame it that way. It's really like we have the agency to choose, right? And it's, we are by blood as well, like you were saying, but we have the agency, like also how do we show up as Jews? And I think after October 7th, we've seen, there's so many people now that call themselves October 8th Jews, right? Like they started taking agency over what Jewishness means to them. But such a beautiful way, the way you just reframed that in my head. I've never heard it that way.
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. It may be actually a particularly I think maybe for an ex-Soviet Jew, it makes particular sense actually also because, for example, I have friends who became progressively more observant. They became observant because as they started having children, they realized that if they want their children to be Jewish, they have to be doing something. Back in the USSR, you wouldn't have to do anything. You remain Jewish just because, again, it's just purely genetics. But in America, if your children, if you don't bring them to the synagogue with you, if you don't light Shabbat candles, if you don't take them to Israel, then there is no reason why they would, where would they take it from? It's really in Judaism, you take it from your family. And I really understood that insight that they had, and I understood the path that they put themselves on, because they wanted their children to be Jewish.
So interesting. You're really giving me a lot to think about because I've really never heard anyone. I guess you have to have an experience of from the other perspective of like, this is your identity no matter what, to understand that when you do have the choice, it's about that. So, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so your book, Be a Refusnik, a Jewish student's survival guide.
Yeah.
How did this come about? Like, what made you write this book? And also, what's a Refusnik? You know, we've mentioned it before, but let's start there.
Yes, that's a good question. If I can
Yes.
show the picture, Be a Refusnik, a Jewish student survival guide, forward by Natan Sharansky. I don't know if people know who he is, but
yeah.
so who is a Refusnik? It comes from the word refuse. So Refusniks were Soviet Jews who decided, it was shortly after 1967 when Israel won in the Six-Day War. So it started in 67. They were really inspired by that victory, and they wanted to understand what it meant to be Jewish. And also there were a number who wanted to emigrate from the USSR and join and be in Israel. This actually happened to American Jews as well. There were a lot of American Jews who were also inspired by the Six-Day War and wanted to go to Israel and be there, make aliyah. But you couldn't emigrate from the Soviet Union. It was prohibited. And so when they applied for an exit visa, they were refused. But not only that, they were refused, and they also were fired from everywhere they had been. Because if you wanted to leave the USSR, you were considered a traitor. And so they were fired from their workplaces. They were expelled from universities. They were really pushed to the margins, really, really marginalized, excluded from society, traitors. But at the same time, they couldn't not work because in the Soviet Union, everybody was obligated to work. So they would take on really menial jobs. I mean, these people with PhDs, doctors, scientists, they would be sweeping the streets, or they would be night guards at different institutions. And when that happened to them, I mean, it was very difficult and really terrible. But a group of them also decided that, well, you know what? Okay, fine. You don't want us, then we're just going to do what we want to do. And so they started spending their time figuring out, what does it mean to be a Jew? Reading literature, whatever they could find, because it was also, you didn't have a lot of Jewish literature in the USSR, but they would try to find somebody who had something left. And then foreigners also started to come. The Soviet Jewry movement began in America and elsewhere. So American Jews who supported Soviet Jews in this. And so they would come and secretly bring books, Jewish books, prayer books, the Torah, the 5 books, the Bible. And so this whole movement started, and they would stage kind of protests and demand a right to emigrate, and it became a really, really big movement. So it was a movement of Jews for their own rights, and it was so they were inside the country doing that, and then outside the country there was a massive, massive movement. Natan Sharansky, who I feel so fortunate that he wrote the foreword for my book, was one of the best known dissidents, refuseniks. He spent 9 years in prison because he stood on his principles and he refused to back down. And I think for context also, I want to explain, I mentioned it a little bit, this is the time when the Soviet Union has launched this massive campaign against Zionism in Israel. It's an international campaign, there are various reasons for why they did it, but it was massive. It was massive inside the country.
Yeah.
And it was massive also outside the country. They were trying to reach the global left. They were trying to reach the third world, as it was known then, the developing countries. But inside the country, it really sparked just an incredible levels of anti-Semitism. And this is partly why I started writing about all of this, because I could see, this is years before October 7th, but I could see as once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, how anti-Zionism was everywhere. Anti-Zionist rhetoric was everywhere, online, at universities. And so I started writing about, here's what happens, because I understood that American Jews couldn't really understand it, American-born American Jews. So because they thought that the worst anti-Semitism comes from the right. And I that's why I felt like I was in this unique position where I could write and I liked to write, and I was able to explain something that other people couldn't understand.
Yeah.
And so I started saying, look, you can't ignore this. You shouldn't ignore this, because once anti-Zionist sentiments become widespread, anti-Semitism is inevitable. And we really see it today. It's really not until today, I would say, that people started to understand it. And it breaks my heart. It's really painful to see that, how people are discovering this. So many people have a sense of betrayal because it's, the anti-Semitism on the side of the spectrum where they belong, on the left, or the liberal, left of center. I actually wanted to write like a big book about Soviet anti-Zionism, maybe a little bit abstract. But then October 7th happened, and I talked to my editor, and we realized that I think this moment required a book that's much more kind of immediate, that speaks directly to young people. We also felt that we need stories of Jewish heroes, because there aren't many, actually. Often when I give talks, I'll ask people to raise their hand and tell me who are the Jewish heroes that they know. And they will usually name just two. They will say they're the Maccabees, and then they're the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And yet here are these refuseniks who fought for years, for decades, on behalf of their Jewish identity. So I wanted to put that in a book, and I wanted to also, in order to make it more understandable and relatable, I told those stories together with stories of young American Jews who have become prominent as activists after October 7th. So like Shabbos Kestenbaum, like Eyal Jacobi, I have 6 young people there. And it's very interesting how when you put these stories together, strangely enough, obviously America is not like the USSR, but when it comes to making a decision to stand up on behalf of your Jewish identity against anti-Zionist demonization, it's really interesting how these stories cross over the generations, and the kind of geography and time. So it's very interesting that way.
Wow. Before I ask my next question, is Natan the one that was like married and then his wife went to Israel and he had to meet her 9 years later, or is that somebody else?
That's him.
That's him. Okay.
Yes,
I just read they had an interview with him, I think, in one of the Jewish magazines, so it rang a bell. Can you share a little bit of what did the challenges for Jewish students on campus actually look like? Can you paint us a picture, and let's take today?
Well, look at the challenge. I think the greatest challenge, to be honest with you, is there's this phrase that I just came across recently called ambient anti-Semitism. Ambient anti-Semitism, meaning that it's just around you. It's like people around you don't even realize that they are singling you out or othering you, making you feel different. Obviously some students face direct aggression, where they are made to apologize for the actions of the Israeli government, or they're made to swear that they're a good person, or that they're not a Zionist, or they're asked to disavow something that's part of their identity. These kinds of things would be unthinkable with regards to any other minority.
Right.
And obviously today we see just straight out harassment, and this is what people do when they claim that they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just being anti-Zionist. But these are obviously acts of anti-Semitism. And, there is a greater understanding now, a growing understanding now, that anti-Zionism itself is really, the phrase is, it's a hate movement. And I think it's very true. People say, well, anti-Zionism is just criticism of the state of Israel. It's not. It's really not. You could criticize Israel. There are plenty of people who do it. Israelis, I'm in Israel right now. Israelis criticize their government every day. It's national sport. Jews criticize Israel all the time, but there's criticism, and then there is demonization. And we're at a stage where Israel has become so demonized, and Zionism has been redefined and demonized. And I think that the hardest thing for Jewish students is if they come to class and their professor it takes on that view, a harshly anti-Israel view, demonizing view, then if you're a Jewish student, you face the question, well, do I stand up Do I contradict do I get into an argument with my professor? I really need to take this class and I need to get a good grade,
Right.
So how do I I think it's very difficult to navigate it, and so I certainly don't make any prescriptions of any kind in this book at all, because I think some people would choose to stand up and argue, come what may, and some people won't. And I think that's completely fine. I don't think it's the job of our young people. We can't obligate all of them to fight.
Right.
Not everybody can be a Shabbos Kestenbaum. Just like in the time of the Refuseniks, not everybody could be a Natan Sharansky. And everybody doesn't even need to be. We don't need everybody to be making big sacrifices. There will be people will self-select. So the people who are willing to really take on the leadership role, they will.
Right.
But I think then for other students, there are other things. There are other ways to kind of resist. I think the main thing today, it's to maintain your own sense of integrity. I don't think it's always about getting into the fight openly. I don't think it's for everyone. It's but just for yourself to answer questions. What does it mean for me to be Jewish? What does my connection with Israel mean to me, if there is one, right? And how do I strengthen it? How do I find people who are like-minded so that I don't feel isolated? That's kind of basic. Actually, one of the lessons in my book is find your people. It's really important so that you don't feel isolated.
Yeah, it was actually going to be my next question. How do you go through in the book, like in practical ways, to support or maybe guide them without saying, you should be a leader or whatever? So I'm guessing you have some chapters because I haven't read it. I will, but I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah. Well, look, I think, to be honest with you, I think it all begins with reframing things, because, every story that I tell in the book, everybody, I think, starting with the Soviet refuseniks and all the way to the young activists today who are interviewed, contemporary activists that I interviewed, none of them wanted to be fighters. They didn't go to universities in order to fight, for any Jewish causes. They just wanted to go and have a good time. But then at some point, something happens, and I often refer to that moment as the burning bush moment. They come across something that they can't, they can't turn away. Something is happening, and they realize that they need to intervene, or they need to take in the message, and they do, and they make that choice. And from there is a reframing that happens, and it very much has to do with how they experience themselves as Jews. Here's this question again of Jewish identity. And so I think that in many ways for young American Jews, and not even only young American Jews, for all American Jews, I think it is a question of what's important for me about being Jewish. We know that this is happening. People are asking themselves these questions, and they are making choices based on these questions. So I can tell you that, the first chapter in my book is called Reclaim Yourself. Reject victimhood, and it's essentially because some people have said to me, well, that's your most radical chapter. And I was surprised. I hadn't thought about it. And I think it's because victimhood is such a, kind of gives you street cred today if you're a victim,
I hear what you're
And
saying.
I think, and I say it again, I say I didn't invent these lessons, they came from the interviews. This is what the people that I feature are saying. And so I draw the title from that. No, the woman that I interviewed, she went to school at Occidental, Alisa Bernstein. She said, we were persecuted in our history, but we shouldn't think of ourselves as victims, because every time we found a way to survive.
Right.
And if we don't, or if we only know, for example, about our history, if our knowledge of Jewish history starts with the Holocaust, then we will always be victims in our own history. And so, I think that's another important shift that can happen, right? To think in more empowered ways about what it means to be Jewish. And here's where I think, by the way, that Israel, I think, can be a great example, because young people here certainly don't think of themselves as victims. So it's things like that, so wherever I propose action, it's really, it has to be a choice for everyone. I think there's a wide range of things that people can do within the lessons that I propose, but it begins with a shift in your kind of frame, your focus.
I'm just realizing that we're talking about students here, and we talked about the age of 1920 and you being a student, and how that really like shifts your identity, and just shows how much more important this is for students, because this is the period in their life where they can really start to answer those questions. Like, I think it goes full circle to when you were a student and now they're students. Very interesting. We talked a lot about your history, and I know, like, I remember even as a kid, my mom trying to explain to me what it was like in the 70s, how they grew up in America talking about Soviet Jews. And I'm sure it was very different than the way you guys felt about yourselves. Like, even now, Americans get very worried about Israelis, and Israelis feel different about their experiences than we do because we're outsiders. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the most misunderstood thing or misunderstood concept we have as Americans of Soviet Jews back in, the 70s that, you've noticed?
Yeah. That's another excellent question. I think because American Jews fought for Soviet Jewry for 25 years almost, I think that there was a feeling that Soviet Jews, as soon as they come to America, they will want to join the synagogues and become part of the community and join the, philanthropic causes and all that. And that didn't really happen. And I think that was quite a cold shower, I think, for American Jews. And it didn't happen, I think, in part, as I was saying early on. First of all, when you emigrate from the Soviet Union, it's hard for people to imagine it. It's kind of like today, emigrating from North Korea. I don't know if you've seen that there is a North Korean dissident who came and she wrote a book and she has talked about it.
I haven't. I'm going to check that out.
So we came from behind the Iron Curtain, no internet, obviously, at that time, 1989. Nothing, like the world outside the country was completely closed to us. So there was this massive culture shock. There was this feeling that we need to really just catch up on so much in terms of culture, in terms of everything, like just basic knowledge. That I think for a lot of people, it wasn't a priority. And for a lot of people, it was also, again, we didn't grow up with any of it. It was hard to join, and so it happened over time. It happened over a period of, I would say, maybe almost 20 years, that I think ex-Soviet Jews, some obviously joined right away, but most, I think, didn't. But then their children started to think about it. And, in New York, there are several groups that I know that are wonderful, who are like the second generation of American Jews of Soviet descent. And they encountered what I was saying before, that they realized that we have to really be part of the Jewish community. Otherwise, our children will not be Jewish. And so I think that there was that discrepancy. I think in some ways, Soviet Jews somehow felt that American, there was just a lot of misunderstanding. So.
Wow, very interesting. I'm glad I asked that question. I think just like sometimes as an outsider, you think you have the answers for the people experiencing the thing. And how often did an American get to talk to somebody Jewish in the Soviet Union until they came, right? So it's almost like we put these expectations on you that you didn't necessarily want, but you never
Well, we weren't prepared for that.
You weren't ready for it. Yeah.
We weren't ready. I think what it is that I think American Jews interacted with or knew mostly about the Refuseniks, who were the activists. They were the ones who put everything on the line in the name of their Jewish identity. And so they already in the USSR studied Hebrew. They studied, religious texts and Jewish history. They came prepared. They were much more prepared when they came to, and I think most of them went to Israel, but some also came to America. So that was a different generation. For the generation of my parents and myself, we lived our we lived our Soviet lives, and then we came to America. It was the first time that we were really confronted with the question of what does it mean to be a Jew?
You just came from a different context, and context really matters.
Yes.
I want to end off by asking you, we talked a lot about you starting to notice these things throughout your years of being here and similarities and questions of, what does Judaism mean to me? What does being Jewish mean? You seem to have answered a lot of them through, your work and your think tanks and your professional work and your book. Now that those questions are answered, what motivates you to continue your work today?
You ask excellent questions.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Because I give a lot of interviews and not everybody knows how to ask original and interesting questions.
Thank you. It means a lot.
What motivates me? Well, look, first of all, I think I still have a lot to say. Fortunately the situation is not improving and it's evolving. And I think today, until probably even a year ago, we were all really I was primarily talking about the left, because the left-wing anti-Semitism, I was doing that because nobody was talking about it. Nobody really understood it, So I thought there are plenty of people looking at anti-Semitism on the right, and the anti-Zionism that we see really comes from the left. But today we see Tucker Carlson, we see Candace Owens, we see the real rise of this conspiratorial anti-Semitism on the right. But it's different from kind of traditional right-wing anti-Semitism, which we often associate with neo-Nazis. So, so there's a lot, like I'm actually writing something now about it. So there's a lot to contribute. There is a lot to say. So that keeps me going. And I think really for the first time in my life, the last few years, I would say, I'm doing things that I'm really interested in and love doing and that feel fulfilling. I mean, the topic is heavy, but I feel like I can make a difference because I have the perspective that not a lot of people have.
Yeah, and it goes back to when I asked you the question about what did you envision for your career, and you mentioned then, like briefly, that now is really maybe the first time that you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And I guess that's really the start. It's not the end. Now that you wrote this book, it's maybe the start for something new, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. There's more to write. There's more to say. And I realize sometimes how much I know and how little you can say through, like just right now I'm working on an article. It's about 1,800 words. And wow. I'm like, there's so much more I can say. No, it's like, I want to write a long piece, but I can't because I know that people can't always read a long piece. Right. It just reminds me, how much I know and how much I'm going to have to write another book.
Exciting!
There will be another book. So amazing. It's fun. It's fun. Yeah. It's exciting.
Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing. It's really, really important. I've had some students right after October 7th talk about their experience. So I know from them how real this is. This is a real issue. And I think we're all starting to realize that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Your work is not just, looking back at the past, but you're really explaining how the past affects the future and how we can learn from the lessons. So Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on here and giving me your time. So fascinating. I'm excited to read your book and to follow what you do next.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.